The True History of the Conquest of New Spain by Bernal Díaz del Castillo. Extracts from the introduction by Señor Don Genaro García. The True History of the Conquest of New Spain, written by Bernal Díaz del Castillo, one of the conquerors, was known and appreciated by historians and bibliographers before it was published. Antonio de Herrera quotes it frequently, Friar Juan de Torquemada also refers to it on several occasions, and the Licenciate Antonio de Leon Pinelo devotes some lines to it in his brief bibliography. Although the original manuscript has always been kept in Guatemala, first by the author, and afterwards by his descendants, and still later by the municipality of the capital, in whose archives it is preserved today, a copy of it was made in the 16th century and sent to Spain to King Philip II, and was there consulted by the royal chroniclers. After its publication in Madrid by Friar Alonso Ramon of the Order of Mercy in the year 1632, the True History was universally accepted from that time onwards as the most complete and trustworthy of the chronicles of the conquest of New Spain. A second edition followed almost immediately in the same city, some 4 years later a third, a fourth, and a fifth. It was translated into English by Maurice Keating in 1800 and John Ingram Lockhart in 1844, into German by P.H.J. von Refus in 1838 and Carlo Ritta in 1848, into French by D. Jordanet in 1876 and José María de Heredia in 1877, and into Hungarian by Karoli Brožek in 1878 and Moses Gall in 1899. Several of these translations obtained the honors of a second edition, as that of Keating in 1803, that of Refus in 1843, and that of Jordanet in 1877. It must be pointed out that no secret has ever been made of Ramon's extensive corruption of the original text. Don Antonio de Leon Pinelo, in his account of the True History in 1629, says, no doubt without malice, that Friar Alonso Ramon kept in readiness a corrected copy for publication. It was no sooner printed than the author of the Isagoge Historico Apologetico found in it, quote, many things added which were not found in the original, unquote. More explicitly, and with a better judgment, Don Francisco Antonio de Fuentes y Guzman, the great-great-grandson of the author, and at that time the possessor of the manuscript, wrote at the end of the same century that the book, published by the Reverend Father Friar Alonso Ramon, differs considerably from the original. Quote, for in some places there is more and in others less than what my great-grandfather, the author, wrote. For I find corruptions in chapters 164 and 171, and in the same way in other parts in the course of the history, in which not only is the credibility and fidelity of my Castillo clouded over, but many real heroes are defrauded of their just merit, unquote. Fuentes y Guzman states that this corruption of the text was not the least important of the motives that induced him to write his own work. At the beginning of the following century, Friar Francisco Vázquez proved that Friar Bartolomé de Olmedo was not in Guatemala at the time of its conquest, as is stated in the edition of Ramon, and therefore he was not the first to spread the Christian faith through that province, unless, as he says, one should concede another miracle, such as that of Saint Anthony of Padua, who managed to be in 2 different places at the same time. Some years afterwards, Don Andres González Barcia, referring to the charge that Fuentes y Guzman had launched against Ramon, arbitrarily surmised that the differences that existed between the edition published by the latter and the original manuscript were matters of no importance, and simply inferred that it was, quote, easy to believe that in copying the author should make some alterations as ordinarily happens, unquote. This defense was not convincing, and on this account our great bibliographer in Mexico, Don Juan José de Eguiara y Eguren, delicately objected that P. Vasquez had declared even the first edition to be falsified, while in Spain the indefatigable chronicler Don Juan Bautista Muñoz endeavored to procure a copy of the original manuscript with the object of ascertaining the alterations due to Padre Ramon. Finally, if there could be any doubt remaining about the bad faith of Ramon, it was completely dispelled by the Guatemalan historians Padre Domingo Juarez, Don José Mila, the Bishop Don Francisco de Paula Garcia Palais, and Don Ramon A. Salazar, who, from personal inspection, fully corroborated what had been asserted by their predecessors, the author of the Izagok, Fuentes y Guzman, and Vasquez. As a matter of fact, we can see at a glance in the following notes that Fray Alonso Ramon, in printing the true history, suppressed whole pages of the manuscript, interpolated others, garbled the facts, changed the names of persons and places, increased or lessened the numbers, modified the style and modernized the orthography, moved thereto either by religious fervor and false patriotism, or by personal sympathy and vile literary taste. As all the later editions and all the translations, without exception, were copied from the first edition published by Ramon, it results that, in reality, we do not know the true history. On the 20th October 1895, Don Emilio Leon, the envoy extraordinary and minister plenipotentiary from the Republic of Guatemala accredited to Mexico, presented in the name of his government to ours, quote, as a proof of friendship and especial regard, unquote, a photographic reproduction of the original manuscript. It was then, with some reason, believed that, at last, we should see the true history published. But this could not be carried out, for accompanying the gift of the reproduction was a prohibition against its being copied and printed. 5 years later, when I wrote my book entitled, quote, Character de la Conquista Española in America y en Mexico, unquote, I was convinced that to perfect our ancient history, an exact edition of the true history was indispensable, and I desired to carry this work through. Soon afterwards, in August 1901, I wrote to the then president of Guatemala, Don Manuel Estrada Cabrera, telling him of my wish to print the precious manuscript. This distinguished official had the kindness to reply on the 1st of the following month that on that very day he had decreed that, quote, an exact and complete copy of the manuscript, unquote, should be made and sent to me for the purpose that I had stated. Señor Don Juan I. Argueta, Secretary of the Interior and Justice in that republic, at once began punctually to send me installments of the copy as soon as they were made, which copy I corrected here and perfected with all care and accuracy by comparing it with the photographic reproduction already referred to, which is preserved in our National Library. The author says that, after making a fair copy of this narrative, 2 licentiates of Guatemala begged him to lend it to them, and that he did so most willingly, but he warned them not to correct it in any way, neither by addition nor deletion, for all that he had written was true. Assuredly, with regard to truth, the author would find no fault with us, for we have taken care to religiously respect the original text, without introducing the slightest variation, not even of the artless orthography or punctuation. Any change would have been dangerous, and we might have fallen into the same error that we attribute to Ramon. Everybody knows that by a single comma one might reverse the meaning of a statement. We reproduce in notes placed at the foot of the page all the erasures that can have any interest for inquiring readers, and in like manner we have transcribed all the various words blotted out, which, besides exhibiting important variations, give an idea of the method of composition employed by the author. Occasionally, when a full understanding of the text necessitates it, or for the purpose of finishing off a clearly implied word or phrase, or of correcting some manifest numerical error, we have ventured to insert some word or number between brackets, so that it can be known at once that it is not the author who is speaking, and the readers are left at liberty to admit or reject the slight interpolation. Finally, we have allowed ourselves to indicate by dotted lines the gaps that are found in the original manuscript, which happily are very few in number, except on the first and last pages, which, in the course of time, have naturally suffered more than the others. May our modest effort meet with the approbation of the intelligent and learned, for we long for it as much as we fear their censure. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, his life. Bernal Díaz del Castillo was born in the very noble, famous, and celebrated town of Medina del Campo in the year 1492, at the very time when Christopher Columbus was joining the two worlds. Bernal tells us at the time that he made up his mind to come to New Spain about the year 1517. He was a youth, quote, of about 24 years, unquote, a statement which corroborates the date of his birth. His parents were Don Francisco Díaz del Castillo and Doña María Díaz Rejón. Bernal was not the only son. He tells us of his brother, probably older than himself, whom he wished to imitate. Bernal himself writes that he was a gentleman and that his grandparents, his father, and his brother were always servants of the crown and of their Catholic majesties Don Fernando and Doña Isabel, which Carlos V confirms by calling them, quote, our retainers and servants, unquote. If the family of Bernal had not enjoyed esteem and respect in Medina del Campo, the inhabitants would not have chosen Don Francisco as their regidor. On the other hand, his financial position must have been a very modest one, for the author most certainly came here to seek his fortune, and often complains of his poverty. After all, the fact that in the true history he discloses a very scrupulous moral sense, a fair amount of learning, accurate philosophy, and a piety out of the common, permits us to infer that his family educated him with great care. It would be exceptional for a man illiterate and untaught during his youth to acquire such qualities in his old age. It is proven, on the other hand, that the author knew how to write when he reached New Spain. Nevertheless, we know nothing for certain about the childhood and youth of Bernal. Our information begins in the year 1514. The author was then 22 years old. From some of his remarks, one may judge that he was tall or of middle height, active, quick, well-made, and graceful. His comrades called him the elegant, el galán. Following the example of so many other Spanish youths, Bernal left his country in the year 1514 to emigrate to America in search of adventures and riches, resolved to be worthy of his ancestry. He accompanied Pedro Arias de Avila, the governor of Tierra Firme, as one of his soldiers. When he reached Nombre de Dios, he remained there 3 or 4 months, until an epidemic that broke out, and certain disputes that arose between the governor and his son-in-law, Vasco Núñez de Balboa, obliged him to flee to Cuba, to his relation Diego Velázquez, who was governor of the island. During 3 years, Bernal, quote, did nothing worthy of record, unquote, and on that account he determined to set out on the discovery of unknown lands with the captain Francisco Hernandez de Cordova and 110 companions. They sailed in 3 ships from the port of Ajaruco on the 8th February, 1517, and after enduring a passage occupying 21 days and 1 fierce gale, they arrived at Cap Toche, where the natives gave them a hostile reception. After touching at Lázaro, they stopped at Champoton, where the natives killed 48 Spaniards, captured 2 of them, and wounded the rest, including the captain, who received 10 arrow wounds, and the author who received, quote, 3 and 1 of them in the left side, which pierced my ribs and was very dangerous, unquote. The survivors returned by way of Florida to Cuba, disillusioned and in ill health, suffering from burning thirst and barely escaping shipwreck, for the ships were leaking badly. When recounting these calamities, the author exclaims, quote, "Oh, what a troublesome thing it is to go and discover new lands, and the risks we took it is hardly possible to exaggerate." Unquote. Nevertheless, Bernal was not discouraged by experience. His poverty, which of necessity increased daily, impelled him to seek his fortune even at the risk of losing his life. And his youth made him naturally impatient. He did not care to wait for the Indians, which Diego Velázquez had promised to give him, as soon as there were some unemployed, and he at once enlisted in a second expedition, composed of 4 ships and 200 soldiers, under the command of Juan de Grijalva, which weighed anchor in the port of Matanzas on the 8th April, 1518. The author says that he went as ensign, but it is doubtful. The expedition went by way of Cozumel and Champoton, whose intrepid inhabitants wounded Grijalva and broke 2 of his teeth and killed 7 soldiers by the Boca de Terminos, the Rio de Tabasco, which they called the Rio de Grijalva, La Rambla, the Rios de Tonala, or the Santo Anton, the Coatzacoalcos, the Papaloapan, or the Alvarado, and the Rio de Banderas, where they obtained by barter more than 16,000 pesos in jewels and low-grade gold. They sighted the Isla Blanca and the Isla Verde, and landed on the Isla de Sacrificios and the sand dunes of Ulua. Thence Alvarado, accompanied by certain soldiers, returned to Cuba in search of reinforcements, while Grijalva, with the rest of his followers, including the author, pushed ahead by Tuzla, Tuspan, and the Rio de Canoas, where the Spaniards were attacked by the natives to Cape Rojo. Then Grijalva, yielding to the entreaties of his soldiers, agreed to return to Cuba. Velázquez, fascinated beyond measure by the gold which Grijalva had obtained by barter, organized a 3rd expedition consisting of 11 ships, great and small, and appointed Hernán Cortés to command it. Bernal again enlisted, as at this time he found himself much in debt. Cortés set out from the port of Trinidad on the 18th February, 1519. The author had started 8 days earlier in the company of Pedro de Alvarado. All met together again at the island of Cozumel, where a review was held which showed a muster of 508 soldiers, not including shipmasters, pilots, and seamen, who numbered 116 horses and mares. Keeping on their course, they passed close by Champoton without venturing to land. They stopped at Tabasco, where they fought with the natives, who gave the author an arrow wound in the thigh, but it was not a severe wound, and finally they arrived at Ulua. They went inland and marched to Zempoala and Quiahuitzlan, and in the neighborhood of the latter they founded the Villa Rica de la Vera Cruz, and they determined to push on to Mexico, whose prince, Moctezuma, had been exciting their cupidity by rich presents of gold and other objects of value. Before undertaking this march, the friends of Cortés, one of whom was Bernal, advised him to destroy the ships, lest any of the soldiers should mutiny and wish to return to Cuba, and so that he could make use of the shipmasters, pilots, and seamen, who numbered nearly 100 persons, as we have already stated. When this had been done without concealment and not as the chronicler Gomara describes it, they started for Mexico in the middle of August, probably on the 16th, and passed without incident through Jalapa, Sicochimalco, Ixhuacan, Textla, Xocotla, and Chalacingo. But on reaching the frontiers of Tlaxcala, they were stopped by the natives, who fought against them for several days. There, the author received 2 wounds, one on the head from a stone, and the other an arrow wound in the thigh, from which he was seriously ill in the capital of Tlaxcala, after Cortés had made peace and an alliance with the inhabitants. On the 12th October, they continued their march by Cholula, where they committed a shocking massacre. Itzcalpan, Tlamanalco, and Itztapalatengo. Here Cacamatzin, the lord of Texcoco, met them in royal state to welcome them in the name of Moctezuma, and they accompanied him along the causeway of Iztapalapa, which crossed the lake in a straight line to Mexico, and from it could be seen on both sides innumerable cities and towns, some in the water and others on dry land, all of them beautified by stately temples and palaces. This wonderful panorama, as picturesque as it was novel, made the deepest impression on Bernal and his companions, and he says, "We were amazed and said that it was like the enchantments they tell us of in the story of Amadis, on account of the great towers and quays and buildings rising from the water, and all built of masonry. And some of our soldiers even asked whether the things that we saw were not all a dream." When they reached the junction of the causeways of Iztapalapa and Coyoacan, they met many caciques and chieftains of importance, coming in advance of Moctezuma, who received the Spaniards a little further on, almost at the gates of Mexico, with sumptuous pomp and extreme ceremony. Many times the Mexican sovereign had contemplated attacking the Spaniards, but weighed down by superstition and rendered powerless by a timid and vacillating character, he now conducted them into the great Tenochtitlan, only to deliver it up to them at once. The autocrat felt himself fatally conquered before beginning the struggle. Then step by step, within a few days he suffered 7 Spaniards, among whom was Bernal, to make him a prisoner in his own palace. He allowed his jailers to burn to death Popo and other native chieftains, whose crime consisted in having, by his own orders, given battle to Juan de Escalante and other Spanish soldiers. He handed over to Cortes Cacamatzin, Totoquiatzin, Cuitlahuac, and Cuauhtemoc, lords respectively of Texcoco, Tlacopan, Iztapalapan, and Tlatelolco, who wished to set their sovereign at liberty. And finally, weeping like a tender unhappy woman, he swore fealty to the King of Spain. With ease and in short time, Cortes was able to collect an immense treasure which amounted to, quote, 700,000 gold dollars, unquote, which he found it necessary to divide among his soldiers. Nevertheless, he made the division with such trickery and cunning that there fell to the soldiers, quote, a very small share, only $100 each, and it was so very little that many of the soldiers did not want to take it, and Cortes was left with it all, unquote. If the author did not complain of this as much as some of his companions, for example, as Cardenas, who even, quote, fell ill from brooding and grief, unquote, it was owing to his having already received from Moctezuma some presents of golden cloths, as well as, quote, a beautiful Indian girl, the daughter of a chieftain, unquote, whom he ventured to beg of the sovereign through the good offices of the page Orteguilla. A gift which he certainly thought that he had gained by his respectful courtesy, quote, for whenever I was on guard over him, or passed before him, I doffed my helmet to him with the greatest respect, unquote. The Spaniards began to enjoy the gold divided among them, abandoning themselves to a life of licentious pleasure, when in March 1520 Panfilo de Narvaez arrived at Ulua with 16 ships, 1,400 soldiers, 90 crossbowmen, 70 musketeers, and 80 horses. Diego Velázquez had sent him to punish Cortes and his followers as traitors, because they had rebelled against him without reason. However, as Cortes was immensely rich, and there is no power greater than riches, he soon won over almost all the soldiers of Narvaez with ingots and jewels of gold, in such a way that when the fight took place at Zempoala, Narvaez was the only man who fought in earnest, until he was wounded and lost an eye. The author figures among his captors, quote, the first to lay hands on him was Pedro Sanchez Farfan, a good soldier, and I handed him, Narvaez, over to Sandoval, unquote. After his victory, Cortes returned with all speed to Mexico, where the inhabitants had risen in arms with the purpose of avenging the inhuman massacre carried out by Pedro de Alvarado in the precincts of the great Teocalli, which Alonso de Avila pronounced to be disgraceful, saying that it would forever remain an ill memory in New Spain. Cortés now brought with him over 1,300 soldiers, 80 crossbowmen, and as many musketeers, and 90 mounted men, without counting his numerous native allies. Although they all reached the great Tenochtitlan on the day of San Juan de Junio, St. John's Day, in the year 1520, they could not make a stand against the Mexicans, who, under the command of Cuitlahuac and Cuauhtemoc, killed the greater number of the invaders and forced the rest, wounded and ruined, for they were unable to save the riches they had collected, to flee to Tlaxcala. The Tlaxcalans received them, lodged them, and attended to them with affection. When they were somewhat recovered, the Spaniards began vandal-like forays through Tepeyac, Cachula, Huacachula, Tecamachalco, the town of the Guayawas, Azucar, Chalacingo, Zacatami, and other places in the neighborhood, enslaving and branding with a hot iron all the youths and women they met with. Quote, "They did not trouble about the old men," unquote. The inhuman mark was placed on the face, and not even the most beautiful young woman escaped it. The author did not assist in all these forays, because, quote, "he was very ill from fever, and was spitting blood," unquote. Cortés then founded a second city, which he named Segura de la Frontera. After the Spaniards had been reinforced by various expeditions that had come from Cuba, they resolved to return to Mexico to recover their lost treasure, and they forthwith took the road to Texcoco. They took with them many thousands of native allies. When the headquarters had been established at Texcoco, Cortés opened hostilities by an assault on Iztapalapa, where he and his followers nearly lost their lives by drowning, for the Mexicans, quote, "burst open the canals of fresh and salt water and tore down a causeway," unquote. The author was very badly wounded by a lance thrust, which they gave me in the throat near the windpipe, and I was in danger of dying from it, and retain the scar from it to this day. Cortés did not think of a direct attack on Mexico. He understood that it could lead to no satisfactory result. He proposed merely to invest the city and reduce it by starvation. So as to accomplish this, he has entrusted to the Tlaxcalans the construction of 13 launches, which he anxiously awaited. Meanwhile, he attacked the neighboring towns with fire and sword. The author did not join in these earlier combats, as he was still ill from his dangerous wound, but as soon as it healed, he again took up arms and accompanied Cortés, who went to assist the natives of Chalco, and distinguished himself among the most intrepid soldiers. On his side, Cuauhtemoc, who was now Lord of Mexico, took measures for the defense of his country with unequaled courage. He had obtained from his subjects a promise that they would never make peace, but would either all die fighting or take our lives. The strife was remarkably prolonged and bloody, and no quarter was given. The siege began on the 21st of May, 1521, and lasted 85 days. Not for one moment did the Mexicans show signs of discouragement. Notwithstanding the scarcity of fresh water and provisions, the superiority of the arms of the Spaniards, and the immense number of their native allies, each day as it came was for them as the first day of the strife. So great was the determination and the strength with which they appeared on the field of battle, and moreover they never ceased fighting from dawn to dusk. When the greater number of them had already perished, the few who still remained stoically resisted thirst, hunger, weariness, and pestilence in the defense of their country, and even then refused with indomitable fortitude the proposals of peace which Cortés repeatedly made to them. In this manner only did they die. The army which was to attack the Mexicans by land was divided from the beginning into 3 sections. It fell to the lot of the author to serve in that of Tlacopan, commanded by Pedro de Alvarado. Many times Bernal was in danger of losing his life, First of all, when the siege had just been commenced. A few days later, when the Mexicans succeeded in seizing him, many Indians had already laid hold of me, but I managed to get my arm free. And our Lord Jesus Christ gave me strength, so that by some good sword thrust that I gave them, I saved myself. But I was badly wounded in one arm. On another occasion they succeeded in taking him prisoner, but it pleased God that I should escape from their power. And, finally, at the end of June, on the day that Cortes suffered his terrible defeat, the author received an arrow wound and a sword thrust. The siege ended on the 13th of August, 1521, with the capture of the northeast corner of the city, where the few surviving Mexicans still offered a heroic resistance. As soon as Cortes was master of the great Tenochtitlan, he got together, for the second time, a great quantity of gold, although it was not as much as he had acquired before. On the division being made again for the second time, the Spaniards were profoundly discontented, for they found that after all their terrible hardships and their constant danger of death, there fell to the share of a horseman $80, and to that of the crossbowmen, musketeers, and shield-bearers 60 or 50. I do not well remember which. The most annoying thing for the Spanish adventurers was that some owed $50 or $60 for crossbows, and others $50 for a sword, and similarly everything that we bought was equally dear. Then too a surgeon named Master Juan, who dressed some severe wounds, charged an exorbitant price for his cures, as did also a sort of quack doctor named Murcia, who was an apothecary and a barber, and also undertook cures, and there were 30 other traps and trickeries for which we were in debt. The author continued to contract debts in consequence, in spite of his sturdy fighting and his many and serious wounds. Although his expectations had not been fulfilled, Bernal did not abandon the hope of mending his fortunes, which had brought him to Mexico, and he accompanied his friend Gonzalo de Sandoval to the conquest of Tuxtepec, a place which, according to the tribute rolls of Montezuma, which the author had studied, abounded in gold. When he arrived there, Sandoval advised him to stay there, and offered him in allotment the rich towns of Matlatan, Orizaba, and Ozotaquipa. But Bernal refused, for it seemed to me that unless I went with Sandoval and as his friend, that I should not be doing what was becoming to my rank. He passed on to Coatzacoalcos, where the town of Espiritu Santo was established, and here Bernal settled, for on the 20th September 1522 Cortes gave him an allotment the towns of Tlapa and Potonchan, which belonged to the province of Simatan. Neither one nor the other proved satisfactory to him, because the land was poor, or more probably because he found no gold there, the metal which represented the only acceptable form of riches to the author and his companions, who had migrated on that very account from the Valley of Mexico, because it produced merely an abundance of maize and aloes. The settlers at the town of Espiritu Santo chose him as their magistrate, a clear proof of the esteem and consideration in which he was held. After all, the new life that Bernal led did not free him from frequent turmoil. He was continually obliged to sally forth and pacify the towns in the province, and this was not without risk, for on one occasion he was struck by an arrow wound in the throat, and the great loss of blood, for at the time it was not possible either to bandage the wound or staunch the flow, greatly endangered my life. During Lent in the year 1523, he set out with Captain Luis Martin to fight the natives of Chiapas, the greatest warriors that I had seen in the whole of New Spain, although that includes Tlaxcalans, Mexicans, Zapotecs, and Minxes. The author now traveled on horseback. Doubtless his towns were not in such poor land as he had imagined. He had to suffer many hardships during his expedition. The people of Chiapas fought like rabid lions, and in Chamula they gave him a good blow with a lance which pierced my armor, and had it not been made of thick cotton and well kilted, they would have killed me, for, good as it was, they thrust through it, and out came a thick wad of cotton, and they gave me a slight wound. In spite of this, he was one of the 2 first soldiers who stormed and took the fortress of the natives. As a reward for his heroic conduct, Louis Martin gave him in allotment this town of Chamula, a place of great importance. On the return to Espiritu Santo, he fought a duel of swords with Godoy in a most noble cause, and both were wounded. Bernal did not enjoy his ease for long, for in obedience to an order from Cortes, whom all the conquistadores greatly feared, he found himself forced to follow Rodrigo Rangel to the conquest of the Zapotecs. It is fair to say that, although he did so unwillingly, for he already felt wearied and Rangel did not inspire sympathy, he acquitted himself with great efficiency throughout the expedition, for which he gained honorable praise. It was then when the natives had hung 7 arrows on him, which only failed to pierce on account of the thickness of the cotton armor, and nevertheless I emerged wounded in one leg. He would, however, not give way, but in spite of all, he pursued the natives for a long distance until they took refuge in some great quaking morasses, which no man who entered them could get out of again except on all fours, with much assistance. He returned to Espiritu Santo without having accomplished anything to his profit, and went on to Mexico, where he was present on the 18th or 19th June 1524, at the magnificent reception given by Cortes to Fray Martin de Valencia and his 12 Franciscan companions, among them Fray Toribio de Benavente, whom the Indians named Motolinia, which means in their language the poor friar, for all that was given him for the sake of God he gave to the Indians, so that at times he went without food, and wore very ragged garments, and walked barefoot, and he always preached to them, and the Indians loved him greatly, for he was a saintly person. The author returned to his town almost at once. He was there at the end of October in the same year when Cortes arrived on his way to the Higueras, whither he was going personally, resolved to punish Cristobal de Olid, who had rebelled. The conqueror was followed by a formidable army and a numerous court of friars and clergy, doctors and surgeons, mayordomos, waiters, butlers, chamberlains, stewards, and keepers of his great services of gold and silver, pages, orderlies, huntsmen, pipers, trumpeters, and fifers, acrobats, conjurers, puppet players, equerries, and muleteers, and a great herd of pigs that they ate as they went along. Among the soldiers and attendants of Cortes there also marched, but not of their own will, Cuauhtemoc and other great native princes. When Cortes arrived at Coatzacoalcos, he ordered all the settlers to go with him to the Higueras, and it was owing to this that the author had to accompany him. Nobody would have then dared to disobey Cortes. It was hard luck for Bernal, for as he says, at the time when we should have been resting from our great labors and endeavoring to secure some property and profit, he ordered us to go on a journey of over 500 leagues, the greater part of it through hostile country. And all that we possessed we left behind and lost. Bernal was not consoled by Cortes appointing him captain on this occasion, nor by taking his own followers with him, who had been recruited from the towns of his encomienda. While the author marched upon Cimatan at the head of 30 Spaniards and 3,000 natives, Cortes overran the towns of Tonalá and Ayagualulco, crossed a neighboring estuary, after throwing across it a bridge which was nearly half a quarter of a league long, an astonishing feat in the way they did it, and he went along the great river Matsapa to the towns of Iquinapa, where he rejoined the author. Together they soon passed through the towns of Copilco, Nacachushuica, Tzacuatan, Tepetitan, and Iztapa, going on in search of Huaycala, or the Great Acala, for there was another town called Acala the Lesser. They penetrated into the forest and lost their way, and found themselves then compelled to clear a track with their swords through the thick undergrowth. They suffered from hunger, and 4 Spaniards and many of the natives died from it, for they fell down as though in despair. In this extremity Bernal and Pero Lopez saved the army, for they found the lost road which soon led them to Temastepec. The pipers, trumpeters, and fifers no longer made music, for they were used to luxury and did not understand hardship, and they had sickened with the hunger. Only one of them had the spirit to play, and all of us soldiers refused to listen to him, and said that it sounded like the howling of foxes and coyotes, and that it would be better to have maize to eat than music. In Ciguatepecat, the author and Gonzalo Mejia went on ahead by the order of Cortes to win over peacefully the inhabitants of Acala, a mission which Bernal, on his part, accomplished satisfactorily, for he soon returned with a large quantity of provisions. But as the soldiers were starving, they seized them all and fought one another for them. In vain did the steward cry out to them that they should leave something for Cortes. The soldiers answered petulantly, "You and Cortes have had fine pigs to eat." When Cortes heard what had happened, he put up with it, and asked the author in the mildest manner whether he had not left a little of the food hidden on the road, and ended by asking him most humbly for a share of it. The author consented and generously invited him to partake of that which he had preserved for himself and the natives from the towns of his encomiendas. The army entered the province of Acala, and there at Izancanac Cortes ordered Cuauhtemoc and his cousin Tetepanquetzatl, the lord of Tlacopan, to be hanged on suspicion of engaging in a conspiracy. The author tells us that he was very sorry for these great princes, and adds, "Their death was very unjust, and appeared an evil thing to all of us, who were on the march." This was at Shrovetide in 1525. Cortes arrived at the land of Mazatecas, and after passing through two towns, one situated on an island and another near a freshwater lake, entered into Tayasal. A little further on, Bernal began to feel very ill from fever and from the power of the sun, which had affected my head and all my body. In this condition, nevertheless, he was obliged to cross the toilsome range of the Pedernales, not so very lofty, but whose stones cut like knives. In front of Taica, a river which one could clearly hear 2 leagues off, delayed the army for 3 days, and Cortes threw a bridge across it, similar to the one constructed at Agualulco, bridges which survived for many years, for the admiration of travelers who were accustomed to say, "Here are Cortes's bridges," as though they were speaking of the pillars of Hercules. Again they felt the pangs of hunger, such as the author had never before experienced. He suffered anguish at this time, "for I had nothing to eat or to give to my people, and I was ill with fever." Cortes ordered him nevertheless to go out and seek for food for the army, and the author, rising superior to his serious infirmities, obeyed him. Guided by his experience and sagacity, he was not long in finding poultry, maize, beans, and other vegetables, with which he promptly supplied all the soldiers. They went on to Tania, a town surrounded by rivers and streams, from which they were unable to get out, for once more they lost their way. Cortes dispatched several Spaniards to find it again, but without result. It was necessary to confine the task to the author, in spite of his illness, for after God it was in him that he had confidence that he would bring help, and when he brought it, for he succeeded in finding the road which they were to follow, Cortes evinced profound gratitude, and made him fair promises. "I pledge you," he told him, "this, my beard, that I owe your honor a debt." The conqueror arrived at last with his huge army at Ocolitzle, a town quite close to Naco, where he expected to fight with Cristobal de Olid. It was not until then he learned that he, Olid, had had his throat cut long before by Gil Gonzalez de Avila and Francisco de las Casas. Nevertheless, before returning to Mexico, he wished to leave his rule established in that far-off district, his boundless ambition making the vast territory of New Spain appear small to him. Thus he founded the town of La Natividad, which is now called Puerto de Caballos, and obliged the natives who had been scared away to return and repopulate Naco. While this was happening, news was received from Mexico that the agent Gonzalo de Salazar, after spreading the report that Cortes and his soldiers had perished, seized their property and their Indians to divide them among his partisans, And he ordered the wives who had become widows to pray for the souls of their husbands, and promptly proceed to marry again, and he even sent to say so to Guasacualco and other towns. It is certain that the wife of Alonso Yanez, an inhabitant of Mexico, respected the order and hurriedly remarried. Nevertheless, while all the soldiers were indignant and excited, as was only natural, and prepared themselves to return as fast as possible to New Spain to recover their wives, their Indians, and their property, and even cursed Cortes and Salazar, and our hearts throbbed with anger. Cortes, formerly energetic, prompt, and venturesome to rashness, now weak, irresolute, and timid, confined himself to weeping disconsolately, shutting himself up for long hours in his room, and permitting no one to see him. Overmuch power had weakened his character. When at last he came out of his room, the soldiers unanimously addressed him and entreated him to embark at once in the 3 ships that were there and go to New Spain, and he answered us very affectionately, "O my children and companions, I see on one side that evil man, the agent, has become very powerful, and I fear that when he knows that we are in the port, he will do some other shameless and daring things to us beyond what he has already done, or he will kill or drown me, or make me and all of you prisoners." The abundant riches which Cortes now possessed made him love life too much. Selfishly abandoning the bulk of his army, he set out on the sea with a few followers. The author had begged him very urgently to take him in his company. He had an abundant right to ask this and other much greater favors, but Cortes, ever deaf to gratitude, left him there to return by land. So by land he went, once more suffering daily hardships, and having also to fight against the natives. He passed through Maniani and Cholulteca-Malolca, the Charpastiques, Cuscatlan, or Cascacatan, whose inhabitants gave him an arrow wound, Petepa, Guatemala, only Tepec, Soconusco, Tehuantepec, Oaxaca, and Mexico. He entered the capital in the beginning of 1527, after a most laborious march extending over more than 2 years and 3 months, during which he had served throughout very well and loyally, without receiving pay or any favor whatever. He returned poor, in debt, and with ragged clothes. Andres de Tapia received him in his house, and Gonzalo de Sandoval sent him garments with which to clothe himself, and gold and cocoa to spend. At this time Marcos de Aguilar was governing New Spain, and Bernal begged him to give him Indians in Mexico, as those of Coatzacoalcos were of no profit. Aguilar merely made him fine promises, alleging that he had not yet received power to apparition Indians. During the same year Aguilar was succeeded by Alonso de Estrada, first of all in company with Sandoval and afterwards alone, whose rule was very unfortunate for the author. Under it, Baltazar Osorio and Diego de Mazariegos turned him out by force from his encomiendas of Maycapi, Tlapa, and Chamula, to the end that they might be incorporated in the new towns of Chiapas and Tabasco. The author, finding it impossible to carry on lawsuits with 2 towns, went to Estrada to obtain justice, and got from him, dated 3rd April 1528, the encomienda of the towns of Cualpitan and Maycapa, which are in the Cachulco range, and used to be subject to Sumatan, and of Popolhuatan in the province of Sitla. Nevertheless, the author was not satisfied, owing to the fact that these towns were of little importance, and did not nearly compensate him for the loss of Tlapa, which contained more than 1,000 houses, and that of Chamula, which numbered more than 400, and the farms more than 200. At the end of this same year, 1528, Estrada was succeeded by the first Audiencia, which wished to proceed at once to the perpetual assignment of the Indians, and with this object ordered the cities and towns settled by Spaniards to appoint attorneys to come to the capital. The arrangement could not have been more opportune nor more agreeable for Bernal, who could now believe with good reason that his labors and his poverty were soon going to cease. He set out in all haste for Espiritu Santo, and was successful in arranging that the settlers should entrust him with their authority, and he returned at once to Mexico. However, the much talked-of division came to nothing, and the judges, far from favoring Bernal, imprisoned him twice on despicable pretexts, together with other old conquistadores. He was obliged at last to return to Coatzacoalcos, persuaded that he would obtain no protection from the first audiencia, and that he must resign himself to live there in the midst of want, but maintaining his high honor, and seeing to it that he lived uprightly, and without indulging in any vice, and justly enjoying a very good reputation. When the first audiencia retired in the month of January 1531, the honest members of the second audiencia assumed control, and, as they appreciated the merits of the author, they nominated him Visitador General of Coatzacoalcos and Tabasco, and they entrusted to him the delimitation of both those settlements, a duty which he carried out with prudence in company with the stipendiary Benito Lopez. Encouraged by these distinctions, and trusting in the rectitude of the second audiencia, Bernal approached it with a request that he should be given some Indian towns in compensation for those that had been taken from him by force, but the judges told him that unless the order came from His Majesty in Spain, they were not able to give them. In the year 1535, the first viceroy, Don Antonio de Mendoza, arrived in Mexico, and Bernal approached him also with the same demand, and again met with a similar refusal. However, if adversity and deception never ceased to lay in wait for and wound the author, he, on the other hand, never gave way to their blows, and always knew how to preserve his energy undiminished. It must certainly have been towards 1535 when, in spite of having already reached the age of 43 years and feeling very weary and poor, he married Teresa Becerra, the eldest legitimate daughter of Captain Bartolomé Becerra, a conquistador of Guatemala, and the first regular mayor of that city. By this marriage Bernal had several sons and daughters, the eldest being Francisco, who was born a year after the wedding. Bernal had already borne to him other children by a native woman, who was perhaps that beautiful girl he had begged from Montezuma through the good offices of the page Orteguilla. Balthazar Durantes de Carranza knew a Diego Diaz de Castillo, a half-caste, and a natural son of Bernal, and Philip II mentions in a royal decree some brothers of this Diego. The author proved to be an excellent father of a family, the greatest, in fact the chief, anxiety throughout his life was not having the means with which to secure the future of his wife and children. He constantly mentions this subject in all his letters, as well as in the True History. As Bernal's difficulties necessarily increased with his growing family, and he knew by sad experience that he could hope for nothing from those governing New Spain, he resolved to go to court to beg for justice from the lords of the royal council. Cortes and the viceroy gave him letters of recommendation to them with which, and the authenticated record of his merits and services, he arrived in Spain about 1540. Once there, he presented his petition in proper form. The lords of the royal council ordered it to be handed over to the fiscal, the licentiate Don Juan de Villalobos, who declared openly and frankly, for some reason of which we know nothing, that he would not allow him anything because he had not been a conquistador such as he asserted. The fiscal doubly offended the author, because at the same time that he ignored his services given during so many years with painful toil and in frequent danger of death, he treated him publicly as an impostor, him who judged and proclaimed the truth to be a thing blessed and holy. This disillusion was without any doubt the most painful of all the author's sufferings. Fortunately, the lords of the royal council took no notice of the fiscal's pleading in settling the matter, and issued a writ on the 15th of April, 1541, advising that a royal decree should be given to the author, addressed to the Viceroy of New Spain, to the end that he should examine the quality and number of the towns which had been given to the said Bernal Díaz, and which he held possessed and which were taken away from him to form the townships of Chiapas and Tabasco, and should give him in recompense for them other towns of the same kind, and as good in the same province, so that he might gain profit therefrom during his Majesty's pleasure. The decree was issued 2 months later, together with another to the same effect, which was addressed to Pedro de Alvarado, the governor of Guatemala, which the author asked for with a view of obtaining the new towns in either of the 2 provinces, wherever they could most promptly be granted. Provided with these 2 decrees, he returned immediately to the New World. He obtained nothing in New Spain, but when he went on to Guatemala, the licentiate Alonso Maldonado, who was governor on the death of Alvarado, assigned him the towns of Zacatepec, Huanaguacapa, and Mistin, which were clearly of little worth, and promised him that as soon as there were others of greater importance, he would give them to him and put him in charge of them. As the promise was never realized, Bernal never escaped from his life of poverty. Without any incidents worth recording, at least so far as is known to us, time went on until 1550, in which year Bernal was summoned to Spain to assist at the Congress of Valladolid, in the character of the oldest conquistador of New Spain. He went there, joined in the Congress, and voted for the perpetual assignment of the Indians, in spite of having heard the humanitarian and persuasive arguments alleged against it by the eminent Fray Bartolomé de las Casas and his worthy companions Fray Rodrigo de la Brada and Fray Thomas de San Martin. His own poverty was a stronger argument. Bernal utilized his short stay at the court to obtain a royal decree, dated the 1st December 1550, ordering the licentiate Alonso López Cerrato, president of the Audiencia of Guatemala, to carry out the previous decree recorded in 1541, and have it respected. On the 1st September 1551, the author exhibited his new decree before the licentiate López Cerrato, who unfortunately did not execute it, in spite of having that very day taken it in his hands, examined it, and placed it above his head, as was the custom, to show that he would obey it and carry it out. We say that he did not carry it out because a year later Bernal wrote to His Majesty that the said licentiate cared only to give assignments to his relations, servants, and friends without taking any notice of the conquistadores who had won the country by their sweat and blood. On this account, the author prays that His Majesty may be pleased to order him to be admitted into his royal house as one of his servants. This petition shows that Bernal did not harbor any hope of improving his miserable lot. Here he nevertheless remained, for he did not succeed in being admitted into the number of His Majesty's servants. Moreover, if it had not been possible for him to prosper during youth and middle life, it was still less so now that he was entering on old age, and we find, as was natural and even to be expected, that he writes to Fray Bartolomé de las Casas on 20th February 1558 that he was still very straitened as he possessed so little property. It must have been a great consolation to him that he continued to be esteemed and respected in Guatemala. He had not ceased to be a magistrate, and this same year he was elected arbitrator and executor, and he had been named the previous year to carry the banner on the feast of Santa Cecilia, an honor which was again conferred on him in 1560, on the occasion of the feast of St. James the Apostle. The affection and consideration which all the persons who knew him had for Bernal Díaz was owing to his charming conversation and noble sentiments, but principally to the fact that in spite of his poverty, he always managed to live with great dignity. Thus then, poor enough, although much loved and esteemed, fearing no one, he dedicated himself to the writing of his true history when he was over 70 years of age, convinced that in the history of the world there was no more daring deed than the conquest, nor more heroic men in existence than the conquistadores, resigned to not having received the reward which was justly due to him, free from pessimism, rancor, and regrets, with a perfectly tranquil conscience, with an exceptional memory, and an intelligence uncommon in its full vigor. His work was now and then interrupted by visits to the towns assigned to him, sometimes accompanied by friends. Neither travel nor change of climate broke down his health, He himself tells us that even at that time he did not use a bed, from habit acquired during the conquest, nor was he able to sleep unless he walked some time in the open air, and this without any covering on his head, neither cap nor kerchief, and that, thanks to God, it did me no harm. With all this, he also tells us, not perhaps without exaggeration, that by the time he had lost his sight and hearing, he had penned but little of the history when the chronicles composed by Paulo Giovio, Francisco Lopez de Gomara, and Gonzalo de Illescas came into his hands. As soon as he began to read them, and observed from their good style the roughness and lack of polish of my language, he gave up writing his history. However, when the first impression had faded, he returned to their perusal, and was then able to decide that they spoke truth neither in the beginning, nor the middle, nor the end, and for this reason he definitely resolved to continue his own work. Probably this did not happen before 1566, for Bernal knew no Latin, and could not therefore understand the Chronicle of Giovio until Boeza published his translation in Spanish. However that may be, it is clear that in the year 1568 he made the fair copy of the true history. We know nothing more of his life. We can only add that the author died in Guatemala about 1581, poor as he had lived, leaving his numerous family no riches except his true and wonderful story, which was, nevertheless, the chief title to glory for his descendants, for in it was enshrined his fair name of honorable conquistador and genial historian. The original manuscript of the true history forms a large folio volume, containing 297 leaves in an old leather binding. Although it is generally in a fairly good condition, there are some leaves partly destroyed, principally those at the beginning and at the end. All the writing, which covers both sides of the leaves, is in the handwriting of the author. On some pages it is well done and normal, on others careless and irregular. The author could not have preserved the same composure throughout the long time occupied in writing his work. The principal subject of this work is the conquest of New Spain and its provinces, and the Cape of Honduras, and all that lies within these lands. Those who tax Bernal with vanity and conceit suppose that when he began the true history, his only object was to tell about himself, an entirely gratuitous supposition, for the author frequently chronicles a series of years without including one of his personal deeds. His work begins with the year 1514 and ends with that of 1568. He divides it into 214 chapters, perhaps intending to finish it with chapter 212, at the end of which he placed his signature and rubrica, but he changed his intention and wrote 2 new chapters in the same year in which he had written chapter 212, namely the year 1568. He still intended to write another, or others, for he declares at the end of chapter 214, "It will be well in another chapter to speak of the archbishops and bishops that there have been." Surely Bernal did not finish his work, unless one assumes the loss of the final pages, which is not probable. The binder who bound up the manuscript understood little of the composition of ancient writings, and attached to the last folio the leaf which contained the signature of the author. Bernal did not pretend to be a man of letters. He confesses his slight knowledge of literature, and on this account humbly begs the indulgence of his readers. May your honors pardon me in that I cannot express it better. Nevertheless, his mode of speech is still current today and is interesting and expressive, in spite of the immoderate use of copulative conjunctions, of its almost complete want of imagery, its words with variable spelling, either obsolete or incorrect, its semi-arbitrary punctuation, its erroneous concordances, its strange contractions, and its unusual abbreviations. Introduction by the translator. 4 eyewitnesses of the discovery and conquest of Mexico have left written records. Hernando Cortés, who wrote 5 letters known as the Cartas de Relación to the Emperor Charles V. The first of these letters, dispatched from Veracruz, has never been found, but its place is supplied by a letter written to the Emperor at the same time by the municipality of Veracruz, dated 10th July, 1519. The second letter from Segura de la Frontera, Tepuaca, is dated 30th October 1520. The third letter was written from Coyoacan and dated 15th May 1522. The fourth letter was written from the city of Tenochtitlan, Mexico, and dated 15th October 1524. The fifth letter, written from Tenochtitlan, Mexico, dated 3rd September 1526, deals with the march to Honduras, the anonymous conqueror whose identity has never been ascertained. The original of this document is lost, and its contents are preserved to us in an Italian translation. It deals only with the customs, arms, food, religion, buildings, etc. of the inhabitants of the city of Mexico, and adds nothing to our knowledge of events during the conquest. Andres de Tapia, whose short but interesting account of the expedition under Cortes ends with the defeat of Narvaez. This document was only brought to light during the last century. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, whose stirring and picturesque narrative is given in the following pages. To these may be added the Itinerario de Grijalva, an account written by the chaplain who accompanied Grijalva on his expedition when the coast of Mexico was first discovered, but this account ends with the return of the expedition to Cuba and does not deal with the conquest of the country. The original of this document has been lost, and it comes down to us in an Italian translation. If the title is correct, it must have been written by the priest Juan Diaz, who accompanied the expedition. It seems to be written in a hostile spirit, and its statements should be received with caution. Many writers followed during the next 40 years who had conversed with actors in the events, and some of whom had heard the story from the mouths of the conquered Indians, and much additional information was thus added to the record. But for a vivid impression of this daring plunge into the unknown, and the triumphant struggle of an isolated handful of Spaniards against a powerful and warlike race, we must rely on the accounts given by those two great soldiers and adventurers, leader and follower, Hernando Cortes and Bernal Díaz del Castillo. The scene of the principal part of Bernal Díaz's narrative lies within the southern half of the present Republic of Mexico, western Central America, and the peninsula of Yucatan, a land wholly within the tropics, which, however, owing to its physical conformation, furnishes almost every variety of climate. A great range of volcanic mountains runs almost continuously through Mexico and the greater part of Central America, near the Pacific coast and parallel to it. A second range of mountains, not so continuous and distinct, runs almost parallel to the Atlantic coast. The whole of the interior of the country between these two ranges may be said to be mountainous, but intersected by many high-lying plains from 4,000 to 8,000 feet above sea level, which form one of the most characteristic features of the country. These plains are sometimes seamed with narrow barrancas, hundreds of feet in depth, often with precipitous sides, caused by the washing away of the thick covering of light volcanic ash down to the bedrock. In common speech, the land is divided into the Tierra Caliente, the Tierra Templada, and Tierra Fria, the hot, temperate, and cold lands. As the slope of the mountains is rather more gradual towards the Atlantic than towards the Pacific, the Tierra Caliente is more extensive in the former direction. 3 volcanic peaks, Orizaba, Popocatépetl, and Iztaccíhuatl, almost in the middle of southern Mexico, rise above the line of perpetual snow and reach a height of about 17,000 feet, and several of the somewhat lower peaks are snow-capped during some months of the year. None of the rivers of Mexico west of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec are navigable, in the sense of being highways of commercial importance. Passing to the east of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, the country of Chiapas and Guatemala does not differ materially in its general characteristics from that already described, with the exception that the rivers are relatively of greater importance, and the waters of the Usumacinta and Grijalva form innumerable lagoons and swamps before entering the Gulf of Mexico. North and west of the Usumacinta and its tributaries, the land, with the exception of the Coxcomb Range in British Honduras, is all low, and the peninsula of Yucatan appears to be little more than a coral reef slightly raised above sea level. There are no rivers, for the rain sinks easily through the porous limestone rock, and the natives have often to seek their drinking water 100 feet or more below the surface, in the great cenotes, or limestone caverns. The sea round the north and west coast of the peninsula is very shallow, the 100-fathom line being in some parts as much as 90 miles distant from the shore. The wet season in Mexico and Central America may, subject to local variations, be said to extend from June to October, but it lasts somewhat longer on the Atlantic than on the Pacific slope. During these months, the rainfall is often very heavy, the states of Tabasco and Veracruz probably receiving the larger amount. During the winter months, occasional strong cold gales sweep the Gulf of Mexico from the north, the dreaded norte so often mentioned in Bernal Díaz's narrative. This wind causes some discomfort, even on the high plateau of the Tierra Templada, which, notwithstanding this drawback, may safely be said to possess one of the most perfect climates in the world. The first question always asked regarding the conquest is, who were the Mexicans and how did they get to Mexico? And to these questions no certain answer can be given. All that can be said is that the whole American race, although it may have originated from more than one stock, reached America in a very early stage of human development, and that the Nahuatl tribes, to which Mexicans belong, came from the northwest coast, which is generally assumed to have been the earliest home of the American race. Whether the people came from Asia at a time when the northern continents were continuous is a question not easily settled, but if such were the case, the migration must have taken place before the cultivation of cereal crops or the smelting of iron ore was known to the northern Asiatics, for no iron implements were found in America, and no cereal was found there that was known in the East, the only cereal cultivated in America being the Indian corn or maize, and this is clearly of indigenous origin. It is therefore not necessary to consider further such a very distant connection, if such existed, between the extreme east and west. There is, of course, the possibility of isolated drifts from Asia to America. Several instances of Polynesians having drifted in their canoes almost incredible distances in the Pacific are on record, and derelict junks have been known to reach the coast of America. But the survivors of such drifts, although they may have introduced a new game or some slight modification of an existing art, are not likely to have affected very materially the development of American culture. The waves of migration from north to south, due probably to pressure of population or search for supplies of food, must necessarily have been intermittent and irregular, and must have been broken up by numerous cross-currents due to natural obstacles. It seems natural to speak of a wave of migration, and to treat it as though it followed the laws governing a flow of water. But to make the simile more complete, we must imagine not a flow of water, but of a fluid liable to marked chemical change due to its surroundings, which here may slowly crystallize into a stable form, and there may boil over with noticeable energy, redissolving adjacent crystals and mixing again with a neighboring stream. There is no reason to suppose that this process had not been going on in America as long as it had in other parts of the world, but there we are often helped to understand the process by written or carved records, which go back for hundreds and even thousands of years, whereas in America written records are almost non-existent, and carved records are confined to a small area, and both are almost undecipherable. In Mexico and Central America, accepted tradition appears to begin with the arrival of the Toltecs, a branch of the Nahuatl race, and history with that of the later Nahuatl tribes. But as to who the people were whom the Toltecs found in possession of the country, tradition is silent. The commonly accepted story is that the Toltecs, whose capital was at Tula, were a people of considerable civilization, who, after imparting something of their culture to ruder Nahua hordes that followed them from the north, themselves migrated to Guatemala and Yucatan, where they built the great temples and carved the monuments which have been so often described by modern travelers. I am not, however, myself able to accept this explanation of the facts known to us. The monuments and architectural remains of Guatemala and Yucatan are undoubtedly the work of the Mayas, who, although nearly related to the Nahuas, are admitted to be a distinct race, speaking a different language, and I am inclined to believe that the Maya race formerly inhabited a considerable portion of central and southern Mexico, and it is to it that we must give credit for Tula, Cholula, and possibly Teotihuacan, all lying within central Mexico, as well as for the highest culture ever attained by natives on the continent of North America. Driven from their Mexican homes by the pressure of Nahua immigrants, they doubtless took refuge in the highlands of Chiapas and Guatemala, and along the banks of the rivers Usumacinta and Motagua, and pressed on as far as the present frontier of Guatemala and Honduras. But it must be admitted that, so far, no account of this migration and settlement is known to us. Once settled in Central America, the Mayas would have held a strong defensive position against Nahua invaders, for they were protected on the Gulf side by the intricate swamps and waterways which Cortes found so much difficulty in crossing on his march to Honduras, and on the land side by the mountain ranges which rise abruptly to the east of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. The passes through the Great Volcanic Barrier, which runs parallel to the Pacific coast, could have been easily defended, while a road was left open along the lowlands between the mountains and the sea, of which the Nahua hordes apparently availed themselves. For Nahua names and dialects are found as far east as Nicaragua. Judging from the architectural remains and the sculptured stones, it may be safely assumed that it was in Central America that the Mayas reached the highest point of their culture, and that they there developed their peculiar script. No Maya hieroglyphic inscriptions have yet been found in central Mexico, and it is only within the last few years that attention has been called to what appears to be a somewhat crude form of Maya script, unearthed as far west as Monte Alban in the state of Oaxaca. I am further inclined to believe that after some centuries of peaceful development had elapsed, the Maya defense failed, and that the people were again driven from their homes by invaders from the northwest, and leaving Chiapas and Guatemala, took refuge in Yucatan, where they founded Chichen Itza, Uxmal, and the numerous towns whose ruins may still be seen throughout the northern part of the peninsula. It is worthy of note that weapons of war are almost entirely absent from the Central American sculptures, and at Copan, one of the most important sculptured figures is that of a woman, whereas in Yucatan every man is depictured as a warrior with arms in his hands, and the only representation of a woman known to me is in a mural painting at Chichen Itza, where the women stand among the houses of a beleaguered town, apparently bewailing their fate, while the battle rages outside. At the time of the Spanish conquest, the highlands of Guatemala were held by tribes of the Maya Quiche race, who were probably descendants of the Mayas and their Nahua conquerors, and were of an entirely lower standard of culture than the pure Mayas. Yucatan was still Maya, but the influence of its powerful Nahua neighbors was strongly felt, and civil wars had caused the destruction and abandonment of most of the old towns. There is yet one Maya area which has so far not been mentioned, the land of the Huastecs, around the mouth of the Rio Panuco, the river dividing the modern states of Veracruz and Tamaulipas. It seems probable that the Huastecs, and possibly also their neighbors, the Totonacs, were the remnant of the Maya race left behind when the main body was driven to the southeast. If they were a Maya colony from the south, as has sometimes been asserted, they would certainly have brought with them the Maya script, but no Maya hieroglyphs have, so far as I know, ever been found in the Huastec country. If, however, they were a remnant left behind when the Mayas migrated to the southeast, we should not expect to find the Maya script in their country, for if my assumption is correct, at the time of the migration that script had not yet been developed. It should be noted that Tula, the reputed capital of the Toltecs, stands on the headwaters of the Rio Panuco, and it may be that if such people existed, on occupying Tula they acquired something of the Maya culture, and thus gained their reputation of great builders and the teachers of the later Nahua immigrants. The exact reason for the disappearance of the earlier races who inhabited Mexico and of the abandonment of the Central American cities may never be known. But religious differences cannot be left out of the question, and one way of regarding the change is as the triumph of the ruthless and sanguinary war god Huitzilopochtli over the mild and civilizing cult of Quetzalcoatl or Kukulkan. Were I asked to give definitely all my reasons in support of the foregoing statements, which differ very considerably from those made by such a recent authority as Mr. Paine in his History of the American People, I must own that I should be at a loss how to do so. However, I think it will be admitted by all students of the subject that we are a very long way indeed from having collected and sifted all the evidence procurable, and until the architecture, sculpture, and other remains of the very numerous ruined towns which may be found throughout the country are more carefully studied and classified, and until the inscriptions have been deciphered, we must put up with such working hypotheses as may best enable us to group such information as has already been obtained. In my own case, a somewhat intimate acquaintance with the sculptures and ruined buildings both in Central America and Mexico has left impressions on my mind as to their relation to one another, which it is not always easy to express in definite terms. In another place, I have given my reasons for believing that the ruined towns of Central America, and probably the majority of those of Yucatan, had been abandoned by their inhabitants long before the Spanish conquest, and consequently the Spaniards are not responsible for the amount of damage that is sometimes attributed to them. In the story of Bernal Díaz, we shall meet with the Mayas in the early pages describing the discovery of Yucatan and the passage of the 3 expeditions along the coast of the peninsula, and then again we shall come in touch with them after the conquest of Mexico on Cortez's journey across the base of the peninsula to Honduras. No attempt was made to subdue the Mayas until 1527, 6 years after the fall of Mexico, and such redoubtable warriors did they prove themselves to be that, although Francisco de Montejo landed his forces and marched right across the northern part of the peninsula, he was eventually obliged to retreat, and by 1535 every Spaniard was driven out of the country. It was not until 1547 that the Spaniards brought the Mayas into subjection. To turn now to the time of the Spanish conquest, we find Mexico peopled by a number of different tribes, more or less nearly alike in habits and customs, and not differing greatly from each other in race, but speaking different languages and dialects. Some of these peoples or tribes, such as the Zapotecs and Mixtecs of Oaxaca and the Tarascos of Michoacan, extended over a considerable extent of country. They were not, however, homogeneous nations acting under the direction of one chief or of a governing council. The township, or pueblo, appears to have been the unit of society, and the pueblos of the same race and speech acted together when compelled by necessity to do so, as it will be seen that the Tlaxcalans acted together owing to the continued hostility of the Mexicans. The main factor in the situation at the time when the Spaniards landed was the dominance of the pueblo of Tenochtitlan, or Mexico. The Mexicans, or Aztecs, were a people of Nahua race who, after many years of wandering on their way from the north, finally settled in the high plain, or valley, which still retains their name. For some years they appear to have been almost enslaved by other tribes of the Nahua race, who had already settled in the valley, and it was not until the 14th century that they established their home on the 2 small muddy islands of Tlatelolco and Tenochtitlan and the Great Lake. By their own warlike prowess and diplomatic alliances with neighboring towns, they gradually increased in power until they gained the hegemony of the tribes and peoples of the valley, and then carried their warlike enterprises into distant parts of the country, even as far as Tabasco and Guatemala. In fact, they became the head of a military and predatory empire, dependent for their food as well as their wealth on tribute drawn from subject tribes and races. They were not a civilizing power, and as long as the tribute was paid, they did not appear to concern themselves with the improvement of the local government of their dependencies. The education of the sons and daughters of the upper classes was carefully attended to under the direction of the priesthood, but, as was only natural in a society so constituted, soldierly qualities were those most valued in the men, and the highest reward went to those who showed the greatest personal bravery in battle. As the field of tribute extended and wealth accumulated, the office of the principal cacique of Mexico, who was also the natural leader of their armies, rose in importance and dignity, and we learn from the narrative that Montezuma, who was the 9th in succession of the great caciques of Mexico, was treated by his people with more than royal ceremonial. The arms and armor of all the Indian tribes appear to have been nearly alike, and they are often described by the conquerors and are shown in the native picture writings that have come down to us. They are the macana or mawahuitl, called by the Spaniards a sword, a flat blade of wood 3 to 4 feet long and 3 inches broad, with a groove along either edge, into which sharp-edged pieces of flint or obsidian were inserted, and firmly fixed with some adhesive compound. Bows and stone-tipped arrows, slings, long spears with heads of stone or copper, javelins made of wood with points hardened in the fire, varas tostadas. These javelins, which were much dreaded by the Spaniards, were hurled from an atlatl, or throwing stick, tiradera. It is worth noting that no bows or arrows are shown on any of the Maya sculptures, but in the stone carvings of Yucatan, on which weapons are always prominent. All the men are represented as armed with short spears or javelins and an atlatl. It may be that bows and arrows were unknown to the Mayas until they were introduced by the Nahua races. The defensive armor consisted of padded kilted cotton worn on the arms or body, a protection which the Spaniards themselves hastened to adopt, and shields, usually round shields, made of wicker and covered with hide or other material, and often beautifully decorated. Sometimes they were oblong in shape, and large enough to cover the whole body. These latter could be folded up when not in use. Headdresses or helmets, usually in the form of grotesque animals' heads, were used by the chieftains, and feathers were freely used in decoration, both in the form of beautiful feather patterns worked into cotton fabrics, or as penachos, lofty headdresses of feathers supported on a light wood or reed framework. A Mexican army in battle array must have been both a beautiful and imposing spectacle, a blaze of color and barbaric splendor. This is not the place to discuss fully the moral aspects of the conquest, but in considering the conduct of the conquistadores and their leader, we must always keep in mind the traditions that influenced them and the laxity of the moral code of the time in which they lived. Some of the Spaniards had served in Italy under Gonsalvo de Cordova, El Gran Capitan, and may have seen Caesar Borgia himself. What can we expect from such associations? All of them were adventurers seeking for wealth. Some, no doubt, were freebooting vagabonds, who would have been a pest in any community. The wonder of it all is that Cortes, with no authority from the crown and only a few ardent partisans to support him, could have kept the control of such a company for so long. He dared to cheat these men out of part of their hard-earned spoil, that he might have gold with which to bribe the leaders of the force which he must always have known would be sent in pursuit of him. When the city fell, he allowed Cuauhtémoc to be tortured to force him to disclose the supposed secret of where his treasure was hidden. Could even his authority have prevented it? It would have been a splendid act of heroism had he made the attempt, but we must think of the disappointed men around him, with a terrible strain of the siege suddenly relaxed, and all their hopes of riches dissipated. Then there is the greatest blot of all on Cortes's career, the execution of Cuauhtémoc during the march to Honduras. No one can help feeling that it was wrong, but there is nothing to show that the reason advanced by Cortés was not a good one. It was only too probable that the Mexicans, longing to return to their homes, were plotting against the Spaniards to effect it. Had such a plot been successful, the Spaniards were inevitably lost. That Cortés was not in a state of mind propitious to the careful weighing of evidence may at once be admitted. A long, dangerous, and toilsome march through a tropical forest is not conducive to unruffled temper. However, the execution of Cuauhtémoc, if it was an error, may have been more distinctly an error than a crime. From our point of view, the Spaniards were cruel and ruthless enough. An army of unbaptized Indians was no more to them than a herd of swine, but their callous cruelty can be no more surprising to us than their childlike belief in the miraculous power of the images and crosses which they substituted for the native idols, or their firm belief in the teaching of their church, which did not admit that an Indian had the rights of a human being until he was baptized. Neither in the 16th nor the 20th century would troops that have seen their companions in arms captured and led to execution to grace the festival of a heathen god and afford material for a cannibal feast be likely to treat their enemies with much consideration. But the fate of the vanquished Mexicans was humane to what it would have been had the victors been Tlascalans or other tribes of their own race and religion. These concluding remarks are not made with the intention of whitewashing the character of the conquistadores. Their faults are sufficiently evident, but to impress on the reader the necessity of taking all the factors of the case into consideration when forming a judgment. The bravery of the Indians was magnificent, and their courage and endurance during the last days of the siege of Mexico is unrivaled. But Bernal Díaz's narrative is written from the Spanish point of view, and it is on the conduct of the Spaniards alone that I feel the need of making any comment. The character of Bernal Díaz himself shows clearly enough in his story. It is that of a lovable old soldier, such as novelists have delighted to portray in Napoleon's Old Guard, simple, enduring, splendidly courageous, and unaffectedly vain. Censure without stint has been heaped on Cortés and his followers for their treatment of the Indians, but no one has ever ventured to question the spirit and resource of that great leader nor the daring courage and endurance shown both by him and his followers. I gladly take this opportunity of thanking Don Genaro García for permission to make the translation from his edition of the true history and for his unfailing courtesy and encouragement during the progress of the work, and of thanking Don José Romero of the Mexican Foreign Office for the loan of books of reference from his valuable collection and for other acts of kindness. The True History of the Conquest of New Spain by Bernal Díaz del Castillo, one of its conquerors. From the only exact copy made of the original manuscript, edited and published in Mexico by Genaro García, translated into English, with introduction and notes by Alfred Percival Maudsley, M.A., Honorary Professor of Archaeology, National Museum, Mexico. Preface. I have observed that the most celebrated chroniclers, before they begin to write their histories, first set forth a prologue and preface with the argument expressed in lofty rhetoric in order to give luster and repute to their statements, so that the studious readers who peruse them may partake of their melody and flavor. But I, being no Latin scholar, dare not venture on such a preamble or prologue, for in order properly to extol the adventures which we met with and the heroic deeds we accomplished during the conquest of New Spain and its provinces in the company of that valiant and doughty captain, Don Hernando Cortés, who later on account of his heroic deeds, was made Marqués de Valle, there would be needed an eloquence and rhetoric far beyond my powers. That which I have myself seen and the fighting I have gone through, with the help of God I will describe, quite simply, as a fair eye-witness, without twisting events one way or another. I am now an old man, over 84 years of age, and I have lost my sight and hearing, and, as luck would have it, I have gained nothing of value to leave to my children and descendants, but this is my true story, and they will presently find out what a wonderful story it is. I will do no more now than give evidence of my nationality and birthplace, and note the year in which I set out from Castile, and the names of the captains in whose company I went as a soldier, and state where I am now settled and have my home. Book 1. The Discovery. The Expedition under Francisco Hernandez de Cordova. Chapter 1. The Beginning of the Story. I, Bernal Díaz del Castillo, citizen and regidor of the most loyal city of Santiago de Guatemala, one of the first discoverers and conquerors of New Spain and its provinces, and the Cape of Honduras, and all that lies within that land, a native of the very noble and distinguished town of Medina del Campo, and the son of its former regidor, Francisco Díaz del Castillo, who was also called the Graceful, may his soul rest in glory, speak about that which concerns myself and all the true conquerors, my companions, who served His Majesty by discovering, conquering, pacifying, and settling most of the provinces of New Spain, and that it is one of the best countries he had discovered in the New World. We found out by our own efforts without His Majesty knowing anything about it. I also speak here in reply to all that has been said and written by persons who themselves, knowing nothing, have received no true account from others of what really took place, but who nevertheless now put forward any statements that happen to suit their fancy. As there is no account of our many and remarkable services, such as their merits deserve, parts missing, these indifferent storytellers are now unwilling that we should receive the recompense and parts missing, which His Majesty has ordered his governors and viceroys to afford us. Apart from these reasons, such deeds as those I am going on to describe cannot be forgotten, and the truth about them will be proved afresh, but as in the books which have been written on the subject, the truth has so often been perverted. I write this story so that when tales are told of daring deeds, our fame shall not suffer, and that on account of such brilliant adventurers, our names may be placed among the most famous, for we have run the risk of death and wounds, and have suffered 1,000 other miseries, venturing our lives in discovering lands about which nothing whatever was known, battling by day and by night with a host of doughty warriors, at so great a distance from Castile that no aid or assistance could reach us, save the only true help, namely the loving kindness of our Lord God, whom it has pleased that we should conquer New Spain and the far-famed city of Tenochtitlan, Mexico, for so it is called, and many other cities and provinces, which are too numerous for me to name. As soon as we had the country pacified and settled by Spaniards, we thought it to be our duty as good and loyal subjects of His Majesty, with much respect for our King and natural Lord, to hand the country over to him. With that intent we sent our ambassadors to Castile, and thence to Flanders, where His Majesty at that time held his court. I shall also tell about all the good results that came of it, and about the large number of souls which have been saved and are daily being saved by conversion to the faith, all of which souls were formerly lost in hell. In addition to this holy work, attention will be called to the great treasure which we sent as a present to His Majesty, and that which has been sent and is being sent daily, and is in the form of the royal fifths, as well as in the large amounts carried off by many persons of all classes. I shall tell in this story who was the first discoverer of the province of Yucatan, and how we went to the discovery of New Spain, and who were the captains and soldiers who conquered and settled it, and many other things which happened during the conquest, which are worth knowing and should not be forgotten. All this I shall relate as briefly as possible, and above all with the assured truth of an eyewitness. If I were to remember and recount one by one the heroic deeds which we, one and all of us valiant captains and brave soldiers accomplished, from the beginning to the end of the conquest, reciting each deed as it deserved, it would indeed be a great undertaking, and would need a very famous historian to carry it out, with greater eloquence and style than my poor words can compass. As later on, parts missing, when I was present and saw and understood, and I will call to mind, parts missing, that repeats, parts missing, imposed as a duty, and delicate style, and parts missing, I will write it with God's help, with honest truth. again parts missing, of the wise elders who say that a good style, missing, is to tell the truth and not to exaggerate and flatter, parts missing, others, especially in a narrative like this, parts missing, would die of it, and because I am no Latin scholar and do not understand the art, parts missing, I will not treat of it, for I say I understand only the battles and pacifications, where I was myself present, for I was one of the first to set out from Cuba in the company of a captain named Francisco Hernandez de Cordova, and we were accompanied on that voyage by 110 soldiers. We explored, parts missing, they stopped at the first place at which one landed, which is called Cape Catoche, and at a town further on called Champoton. More than half of us were killed, and the captain received 10 arrow wounds, and all the rest of us soldiers got 2 arrow wounds, and the Indians attacking us with such skill we were obliged, with the greatest difficulty, to return to the island of Cuba, whence we had set out with the fleet. And the captain died almost as soon as we landed, and of the 110 soldiers who set out with us, 57 were left behind dead. After this first warlike expedition, I set out a second time from this same island of Cuba, under another captain named Juan de Grijalva, and we again had great warlike encounters with these same Indians of the pueblo of Champoton, and in this second battle many of our soldiers were killed. From that pueblo we went on along the coast exploring until we arrived at New Spain, and then kept on our way until we reached the province of Panuco. Then a second time we had to turn back to the island of Cuba, baffled and exhausted both from hunger and thirst, and from other reasons which I will set forth in the chapter which treats of this expedition. To go back to my story, I set out for the third time with the daring and valiant Captain Don Hernando Cortez, who later on was made Marqués de Valle and received other titles of honor. I repeat that no other captain or soldier went to New Spain 3 times in succession on one expedition after another as I did, so that I am the earliest discoverer and conqueror who has ever lived or is now living in New Spain. Although many soldiers went twice on voyages of discovery, the first time with Juan de Grijalva, whom I have already mentioned, and the second time with the gallant Captain Cortez, yet they never went 3 times in succession. If they went the first time with Francisco Hernandez de Cordova, they did not go the second time with Grijalva, nor the third time with the valiant Cortez. God has been pleased to preserve me through many risks of death, both during this laborious discovery and in the very bloody Mexican wars, and I give God many thanks for it, in order that I may tell and declare the events that happened in those wars, so that studious readers may give them attention and thought. I was 24 years old when Diego Velázquez, the governor of the island of Cuba, who was my kinsman, promised to give me some Indians as soon as there were any available, but I did not care to be kept waiting until this should happen. I always had a zeal for soldiering, and it is becoming that a man should have, both in order to serve God and the king and to endeavor to gain renown, and as being such a life that honorable men should seek. And I gradually put from my mind the death of my companions who were killed in those times, and the wounds that I myself received, and the fatigue and hardship I endured, and which all must endure who set out to discover new lands, and being as we were but a small company, dared to enter into great towns swarming with hostile warriors. I myself was always at the front and never descended to the many vices prevalent in the island of Cuba, as will be clearly seen in the course of this story. In the year 1514, I came from Castile and began my career as a soldier on terra firma, then went on to the discovery of Yucatan and New Spain, and as my forefathers, my father and my brother had always been servants of the crown and of the Catholic kings of glorious memory Don Fernando and Doña Isabel, I wished to be something like them. In the year 1514, as I have already said, there came out as governor of terra firma a gentleman named Pedrarius d'Avila. I agreed to go with him to his government and the country conquered by him. So as to shorten the story, I will not relate what happened on the voyage, more than to say sometimes with good weather and other times with bad weather, we arrived at Nombre de Dios, for so it was named. Some 3 or 4 months after the settlement was formed, there came a pestilence from which many soldiers died, and in addition to this, all the rest of us fell ill and suffered from bad ulcers on the legs. Then disputes arose between the governor and a nobleman named Vasco Nunez de Balboa, the captain, who had conquered that province, to whom Pedrarias Davila had given his daughter, Doña somebody Arias de Peñalosa, in marriage. But it seems that after marriage he grew suspicious of his son-in-law, believing that he would rise in rebellion and lead a body of soldiers towards the South Sea, so he gave orders that Balboa should have his throat cut and certain of the soldiers should be punished. As we were witnesses of what I have related, and of other revolts among the captains, and as the news reached us that the island of Cuba had lately been conquered and settled, and that a gentleman named Diego Velázquez, a native of Cuellar, who has already been mentioned by me, had been made governor of the island, some of us gentlemen and persons of quality, who had come out with Pedrarias Davila, made up our minds to ask him to give us permission to go to Cuba, and he willingly did so, as he had no need of all the soldiers he had brought with him from Castile, as there was no one left to conquer. Indeed, the country under his rule is small and thinly peopled, and his son-in-law Vasco Nunez de Balboa had already conquered it and ensured peace. As soon as leave was granted, we embarked in a good ship and with fair weather reached the island of Cuba. On landing, we went at once to pay our respects to the governor, who was pleased at our coming and promised to give us Indians as soon as there were any to spare. When 3 years had gone by, counting both the time we were in terra firma and that which we had passed in the island of Cuba, and it became evident that we were merely wasting our time, 110 of us got together, most of us comrades who had come from terra firma, and the other Spaniards of Cuba who had had no Indians assigned to them, and we made an agreement with a gentleman named Francisco Hernandez de Cordova, whose name I have already mentioned, a rich man who owned an Indian pueblo in the island, that he should be our leader, for he was well fitted for the post, and that we should try our fortune in seeking and exploring new lands where we might find employment. With this object in view, we purchased 3 ships, 2 of them of good capacity, and the third, a bark, bought on credit from the governor, Diego Velázquez, on the condition that all of us soldiers should go in the 3 vessels to some islands lying between Cuba and Honduras, which are now called the islands of the Guanajes, and make war on the natives, and load the vessels with Indians as slaves, with which to pay him for his bark. However, as we soldiers knew that what Diego Velázquez asked of us was not just, we answered that it was neither in accordance with the law of God nor of the king that we should make freemen slaves. When he saw that we had made up our minds, he said that our plan to go and discover new countries was better than his, and he helped us in providing food for our voyage. Certain inquisitive gentlemen have asked me why I have written down these words which Diego Velázquez uttered about selling us the ship, and they say they have an ugly look and should not have been inserted in this history. I replied that I write them here because it is desirable on account of the lawsuits which Diego Velázquez and the Bishop of Burgos and Archbishop of Orzano, whose name is Juan Rodriguez de Fonseca, brought against us. To return to my story, we now found ourselves with 3 ships stored with cassava bread, which is made from a root, and we bought some pigs which cost $3 apiece, for in those days there were neither sheep nor cattle in the island of Cuba, for it was only beginning to be settled, and we added a supply of oil and bought beads and other things of small value to be used for barter. We then sought out 3 pilots, of whom the chief, who took charge of the fleet, was called Anton de Alaminos, a native of Palos. The second came from Triana, and was named Camacho, and the third was Juan Alvarez el Manquillo from Huelva. We also engaged the necessary number of sailors, and procured the best supply that we could afford of ropes, cordage, cables, and anchors, and casks for water and other things needed for the voyage, and this all to our own cost and regret. When all the soldiers were mustered, we set out for a port which in the Indian language is called Ajaruco, on the north coast, 8 leagues from a town named San Cristobal, which was then inhabited and which 2 years later was moved to the present site of Havana. In order that our voyage should proceed on right principles, we wished to take with us a priest named Alonso Gonzalez, who was then living in the said town of San Cristobal, and he agreed to come with us. We also chose for the office of Vidor, in His Majesty's name, a soldier named Bernardino Iñiguez, a native of Santo Domingo de la Calzada, so that if God willed that we should come on rich lands, or people who possessed gold or silver or pearls or any other kind of treasure, there should be a responsible person to guard the royal fifth. After all was arranged and we had heard Mass, we commended ourselves to God our Lord, and to Our Lady, the Sainted Virgin Mary, His Blessed Mother, and set out on our voyage in the way I will now relate. Chapter 2. How we discovered the province of Yucatan. On the 8th day of the month of February, in the year 1517, we left the Havana from the port of Ajaruco, which is on the north coast, and in 12 days we doubled Cape San Antonio, which is also called in the island of Cuba the land of the Guanahataves, who are Indians like savages. When we had passed this cape, we were in the open sea, and trusting to luck, we steered towards the setting sun, knowing nothing of the depth of water, nor of the currents, nor of the winds which usually prevail in that latitude, so we ran great risk of our lives. Then a storm struck us, which lasted 2 days and 2 nights, and raged with such strength that we were nearly lost. When the weather moderated, we kept on our course, and 21 days after leaving port we sighted land, at which we rejoiced greatly and gave thanks to God. This land had never been discovered before, and no report of it had reached us. From the ships we could see a large town standing back about 2 leagues from the coast, and as we had never seen such a large town in the island of Cuba, nor in Hispaniola, we named it the Great Cairo. We arranged that the 2 vessels which drew the least water should go in as near as possible to the coast to examine the land and see if there was an anchorage near the shore. On the morning of the 4th March, we saw 10 large canoes, called piraguas, full of Indians from the town, approaching us with oars and sails. The canoes were large ones, made like hollow throws, cleverly cut out from huge single logs, and many of them would hold 40 Indians. To go back to my story, the Indians in the 10 canoes came close to our ships, and we made signs of peace to them, beckoning with our hands, and waving our cloaks to induce them to come and speak to us, although at that time we had no interpreters who could speak the languages of Yucatan and Mexico. They approached quite fearlessly, and more than 30 of them came on board the flagship, and we gave them each a present of a string of green beads, and they passed some time examining the ships. The chief man among them, who was a cacique, made signs to us that they wished to embark in their canoes and return to their town, and that they would come back again another day with more canoes in which we could go ashore. These Indians were clothed in cotton shirts, made like jackets, and covered their persons with a narrow cloth which they called masteles, and they seemed to us a people superior to the Cubans, for the Cuban Indians go about naked, only the women wearing a cloth reaching to the thighs, which cloths they call naguas. To return to my story, the next morning the same cacique returned to the ships and brought 12 large canoes, which I have already said are called piraguas, with Indian rowers, and with a cheerful face and every appearance of friendliness, made signs that we should go to this town, where they would feed us and supply all our needs, and that in those canoes of his we could land. He kept on saying in his language, Kones Katoshe, which means come to my houses, and for that reason we called the land Cape Katoche, and it is still so named on the charts. When our captain and the soldiers saw the friendly overtures the chief was making to us, we agreed to lower the boats from our ships, and in the vessel of least draught and in the 12 canoes to go ashore all together, and because we saw that the shore was crowded with Indians from the town, we arranged to land all of us at the same moment. When the cacique saw us all on shore, but showing no intention of going to his town, he again made signs to our captain that we should go with him to his houses, and he showed such evidence of peace and goodwill that our captain asked our advice whether we should go on or no, and most of the soldiers were of opinion that with the precaution of taking all our arms with us we should go on. And we took with us 15 crossbows and 10 muskets, so with the cacique as our guide, we began our march along the road, accompanied by many Indians. We moved on in this way until we approached some brush-covered hillocks, when the cacique began to shout and call out to some squadrons of warriors who were lying in ambush, ready to fall upon us and kill us. On hearing the cacique's shouts, the warriors attacked us in great haste and fury, and began to shoot with such skill that the first flight of arrows wounded 15 soldiers. These warriors wore armor made of cotton reaching to the knees, and carried lances and shields, bows and arrows, slings and many stones. After the flight of arrows, the warriors, with their feathered crests waving, attacked us hand to hand, and hurling their lances with all their might they did us much damage. However, thank God, we soon put them to flight when they felt the sharp edge of our swords, and the effect of our guns and crossbows, and 15 of them fell dead. A short distance ahead of the place where they attacked us was a small plaza with 3 houses built of masonry, which served as queues and oratories. These houses contained many pottery idols, some with the faces of demons and others with women's faces, and there were others of evil figures of Indians, who appeared to be committing sodomy one with another. Within the houses were some small wooden chests, and in them were some other idols, and some little discs made partly of gold, but more than half of copper, and some necklaces and 3 diadems, and other small objects in the form of fish and others, like the ducks of the country, all made of inferior gold. When we had seen the gold and the houses of masonry, we felt well content at having discovered such a country, for at that time Peru was unknown. Indeed, it was not discovered until 20 years later. While we were fighting with the Indians, the priest Gonzales had accompanied us, and he took charge of the chests and the gold and the idols and carried them to the ship. In these skirmishes we took 2 Indians prisoners, and later on, when they were baptized, one was named Julian and the other Melchior. Both of them were cross-eyed. When the fight was over, we returned to our ships and went on exploring along the coast towards the setting sun. We set sail as soon as the wounded were cared for, and what else happened I will tell later on. Chapter 3. How we coasted along towards the west, discovering capes and deep waters, roadsteads and reefs. Believing this land to be an island, as the pilot Anton de Alaminos had assured us that it was, we traveled with the greatest caution, sailing only by day and anchoring by night. After voyaging in this manner for 15 days, we described from the ship what appeared to be a large town near to a great bay or creek, and we thought that there might be a river or stream there, where we could provide ourselves with water, of which we had great need, because the casks and other vessels which we had brought with us were not watertight. It was because our fleet was manned by poor men who had not money enough to purchase good casks and cables, that the water ran short. We had to land near the town, and as it was Sunday, the day of San Lazaro, we gave the town that name, and so it is marked on the charts, but its proper Indian name is Campeche. In order that we could all of us land at the same time, we agreed to approach the shore in the smallest of the vessels, and in the 3 boats, with all our arms ready, so as not to be caught as we had been at Cape Catoche. In these roadsteads and bays, the water shallows very considerably at low tide, so that we had to leave our ships anchored more than a league from the shore. We went ashore near the town, where there was a pool of good water, used by the people of the place for drinking water, for as far as we had seen there were no rivers in this country. We landed the casks, intending to fill them with water, and return to our ships. When the casks were full, and we were ready to embark, a company of about 50 Indians, clad in good cotton mantles, came out in a peaceful manner from the town. From their appearance we believed them to be caciques, and they asked us by signs what it was we were looking for, and we gave them to understand that we had come for water, and wished to return at once to our ships. They then made signs with their hands to find out whether we came from the direction of the sunrise, repeating the word Castellan, and we did not understand what they meant by Castellan. They then asked us by signs to go with them to their town, and we took counsel together as to what we should do, and decided to go with them, keeping well on the alert and in good formation. They led us to some large houses, very well built of masonry, which were the temples of their idols, and on the walls were figured the bodies of many great serpents and snakes, and other pictures of evil-looking idols. These walls surrounded a sort of altar covered with clotted blood. On the other side of the idols were symbols like crosses, and all were colored. At all this we stood wondering, as they were things never seen or heard of before. It seemed as though certain Indians had just offered sacrifices to their idols, so as to ensure victory over us. However, many Indian women moved about us, laughing and with every appearance of goodwill. But the Indians gathered in such numbers that we began to fear that there might be some trap set for us, as at Katoche. While this was happening, many other Indians approached us, wearing very ragged mantles and carrying dry reeds, which they deposited upon the plain, and behind them came 2 squadrons of Indian archers in cotton armor, carrying lances and shields, slings and stones, and each captain drew up his squadron at a short distance from where we stood. At that moment there sallied from another house, which was an oratory of their idols, 10 Indians, clad in long white cotton cloaks, reaching to their feet, and with their long hair reeking with blood, and so matted together that it could never be parted or even combed out again, unless it were cut. These were the priests of the idols, who in New Spain are commonly called papas, and such I shall call them hereafter. These priests brought us incense of a sort of resin which they called copal, and with pottery braziers full of live coals they began to fumigate us, and by signs they made us understand that we should quit their land before the firewood, which they had piled up there, should burn out, otherwise they would attack us and kill us. After ordering fire to be put to the reeds, the priests withdrew without further speech. Then the warriors, who were drawn up in battle array, began to whistle and sound their trumpets and drums. When we perceived their menacing appearance and saw great squadrons of Indians bearing down on us, we remembered that we had not yet recovered from the wounds received at Cap Catoche, and had been obliged to throw overboard the bodies of 2 soldiers who had died, and fear fell on us, so we determined to retreat to the coast in good order, and began to march along the shore towards a large rock which rose out of the sea, while the boats and the small bark laden with the water casks coasted along close and shore. We had not dared to embark near the town where we had landed, on account of the great press of Indians, for we felt sure they would attack us as we tried to get in the boats. As soon as we had embarked and got the casks on board the ships, we sailed on for 6 days and nights in good weather. Then we were struck by a norther, which is a foul wind on that coast, and it lasted 4 days and nights, and so strong was the storm that it nearly drove us ashore, so that we had to drop anchor, but we broke 2 cables, and 1 ship began to drag her anchor. Ah, the danger was terrible, for if our last cable had given way, we should have been driven ashore to destruction. But thank God we were able to ease the strain on the cable by lashing it with pieces of rope and hawsers, and at last the weather moderated. Then we kept on our course along the coast, going ashore whenever we were able to do so to get water. For, as I have already said, the casks we carried were not only leaky, but were gaping open, and we could not depend upon them, and we hoped that by keeping near the coast we should be able to find water, whenever we landed, either in pools or by digging for it. As we were sailing along on our course, we came in sight of a town, and about a league on the near side of it there was a bay which looked as though it had a river or stream running into it, so we determined to anchor. On this coast, the tide runs out so far that there is danger of the ships being stranded. So for fear of this, we dropped anchor at the distance of a league from the shore, and we landed in that bay from the vessel, of least draught, and from the boats, carrying all our casks along with us to fill them with water. We landed soon after midday, well armed with crossbows and guns. This landing place was about a league from the town, near to some pools of water, and maize plantations, and a few small houses built of masonry. The town is called Potanchan. We filled our casks with water, but we could not carry them away on account of the great number of warriors who fell on us. I will stop now and tell later on about the attack they made on us.